My mom died, so I came instead, mail order's little daughter said. A rancher waits at the dusty train depot, expecting a bride. But when the steam clears, it's only a child. A little girl clutching a Bible, her voice trembling as she explains her mother is gone. Yet she has come in her place. The town whispers scandal. The church bell tolls judgment. And just as the rancher begins to open his heart, the law rides in with papers to tear them apart. But hidden inside the child's trunk lies a letter, and a secret that could change everything. In a land where family is bought, broken, or stolen by law, can a grieving man, a motherless girl, and a woman scorned by prejudice fight to stay together? Or will the frontier's harsh justice rip apart the only home they've ever known? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Denver rail depot as Ephraim Cole shifted his weight from one dusty boot to the other. His Sunday coat felt stiff and uncomfortable, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd worn it. The wooden platform creaked beneath his feet as he paced, checking his pocket watch for the third time in as many minutes. The distant whistle of the approaching train pierced the crisp morning air. Ephraim's heart quickened its pace. After 2 years of solitude in his cabin, the prospect of a new beginning made his palms sweat beneath his worn leather gloves. The iron beast rolled into the station with a screech of metal on metal, belching steam that swirled around the platform. Ephraim straightened his collar and searched the faces of the descending passengers. He was looking for Sarah May, the woman whose letters had given him hope that his empty home might know warmth again. But as the steam cleared and the last passengers stepped down, his eyes fell upon a small figure standing alone on the platform. A girl, no more than 9 years old, clutched a worn Bible in one hand and kept the other firmly planted on a battered trunk. Her dress was clean but threadbare, her boots obviously mended more than once. The child's eyes found his, and she walked toward him with purpose, her slight frame carrying a dignity beyond her years. "Mr. Cole?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "I'm Susan May. My mom died, so I came instead." Ephraim felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest as he processed her words. "Your mother, Sarah May?" The station master approached, papers in hand. "Mr. Cole?" "There's something you should know." He spoke in hushed tones, though Susan stood close enough to hear. "The woman listed for marriage. She took ill with consumption during the journey, passed away 3 days ago in Kansas City." Ephraim's throat tightened. He'd lost a wife once before to fever, and now the promise of a new start had died before he'd even met her. The depot clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, appeared at the station master's elbow. "No need to worry yourself, Mr. Cole. The orphanage can collect her tomorrow. They always do with these cases." Susan's small hand tightened on her Bible, her knuckles white with tension. Her chin lifted slightly, but Ephraim caught the flash of fear in her eyes. "Come sit with me a moment," Ephraim said softly, gesturing to a nearby bench. Susan followed, her trunk scraping against the wooden planks as she dragged it along. They sat together, the morning bustle of the station continuing around them. "Your mother," Ephraim began carefully. "She wrote to me about herself, but she never mentioned. She didn't want to burden you with knowing about me until you met her," Susan interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said sometimes men don't want children right away, but she has a letter for you." Her hand went to her pocket, where Ephraim could see the edge of an envelope, carefully folded and sealed. When he reached for it, Susan pulled back slightly. "Not here," she said. "Somewhere safe." That's what Mom said. To give it to you somewhere safe. Ephraim studied the child before him. Her clothes were worn but clean, her hair neatly braided, though wisps had come loose during the journey. She sat straight-backed on the bench, her small feet barely touching the ground. Everything about her spoke of care and teaching. Someone had raised her with love and attention. The morning sun climbed higher, and Ephraim knew he needed to make a decision. His cabin was a half-day's ride from Denver, a simple place with basic furnishings and none of the comforts a child might need. But the alternative was leaving this girl, Sarah's daughter, to be collected by strangers and taken to an orphanage. He thought of his own loss, the empty rooms that still echoed with memories of his late wife, the pain that had driven him to seek a mail-order bride in the first place. Now, instead of a new wife, he faced the responsibility of a child he'd never expected. "Do you know how to ride in a wagon?" he asked finally. Susan nodded. "Yes, sir. Mom and I traveled in wagons before. I won't be any trouble." Ephraim stood, placing his hat back on his head. "It's a long journey to my place. We should get started if we want to arrive before dark." He reached for her trunk, but Susan spoke up quickly. "I can help carry it, Mr. Cole. I'm stronger than I look." "I reckon you are," he said, managing a small smile. "But let me manage this for now." He lifted the trunk, noting how light it was, all of a child's worldly possessions contained in one small space. The station master raised his eyebrows as Ephraim approached with Susan in tow. "You're taking her, then?" "For now," Ephraim replied, his voice gruff, "until things get sorted proper." He led Susan through the station and out to where his wagon waited. The morning air had warmed, and dust motes danced in the sunlight as he secured her trunk in the back. He helped her climb onto the wooden seat, noting how carefully she held her Bible and how she arranged her skirts just so. The manners of a well-taught child. As Ephraim took his place beside her and gathered the reins, he felt the weight of Sarah's letter in Susan's pocket between them, like a promise waiting to be revealed. The wheels creaked as they pulled away from the station, leaving behind the life he'd expected to find and heading towards something entirely unknown. Susan sat quietly beside him, her small hands folded in her lap, the Bible resting there like an anchor. She watched the town give way to open country with alert eyes, taking in everything but asking no questions. Only once did she speak, when they passed a flowering cactus by the roadside. "Mom would have liked that," she said softly. "She always said beauty grows in the hardest places, if you know where to look." Ephraim glanced at the child beside him, seeing in her face the same quiet strength he'd admired in Sarah's letters. He clicked to the horses, guiding them toward home, knowing that somewhere in the sealed envelope he carried answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they left Denver behind, the wagon rolling steadily toward Ephraim's cabin and whatever future awaited them there. His Sunday coat gathered dust from the trail, but for once he didn't mind. He had a night to decide what came next, and a letter to read when they reached somewhere safe. The wagon wheels creaked steadily over the rutted trail as the afternoon sun beat down on Ephraim and Susan. Dust clouds billowed behind them, painting the air a hazy gold. Susan sat straight-backed beside him, her small hands wrapped around her mother's Bible as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The leather-bound book looked well-loved, its corners softened with use. Ephraim cleared his throat. "You, been traveling long?" "3 weeks, sir," Susan replied softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We started from St. Louis." He nodded, searching for more words. "Must have seen plenty of country then." "Yes, sir." Mom said each new place was like turning a page in God's own picture book. A shadow crossed her face at the mention of her mother, and she fell silent again. Ephraim tried once more. "You like animals? Got some horses back at the ranch, and chickens, too." "I do like animals," Susan answered politely. "Mom taught me to gather eggs without spooking the hens." Every conversation seemed to lead back to her mother, and Ephraim felt the weight of that loss hanging between them. He lapsed into silence, letting the steady clip-clop of hooves fill the space instead. By mid-afternoon, they reached the final ridge overlooking his property. The wagon creaked to a halt as Ephraim gestured toward the valley below. "There's my place." Susan leaned forward slightly, taking in the sight. The cabin sat alone in the valley, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A split rail fence traced the boundaries of the nearest pasture, while a sturdy corral held 2 horses who lifted their heads at the sound of the wagon. The late sunlight caught the window glass, making it gleam like a beacon. "It ain't much," Ephraim said, suddenly aware of how modest it must look to a child. "But it's home." "It's lovely," Susan whispered, and something in her voice made Ephraim glance her way. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she blinked them back quickly. They made their way down the slope, the wagon swaying gently. As they drew closer, details emerged. The worn path to the well, the woodpile stacked neat against the cabin wall, the remnants of last year's garden waiting for spring planting. Ephraim helped Susan down from the wagon, then lifted her trunk. "Let me show you inside." The cabin door creaked open to reveal a simple room, tidy but spare. A pot of beans simmered on the iron stove, filling the air with warmth and the promise of supper. A ladder led to the sleeping loft, and a few chairs gathered around a sturdy table. An oil lamp cast soft light in the growing dusk. "You can set your things there for now," Ephraim said, placing her trunk near the wall. "I'll fix up a proper sleeping spot for you." He busied himself with preparations, dragging out an old cot and some blankets. Susan stood quietly, taking in her surroundings with solemn eyes. When he glanced her way, she was running one finger along the spine of her Bible, as if drawing comfort from its familiar texture. "Supper's about ready," he announced, pulling cornbread from the warming oven. "It ain't fancy, but it'll fill you up." Susan helped him set the table without being asked, her movements careful and practiced. When the food was laid out, beans steaming in their bowls, cornbread golden on the plate between them, she folded her hands and bowed her head. "Would you like to say grace?" Ephraim offered, more out of politeness than habit. He couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed over a meal. Susan nodded, her voice small but clear in the quiet cabin. "Dear Lord, thank you for this food, and for bringing me safe to this place. Please bless this house and," her voice caught slightly, "and bless my new papa, amen." The word papa hit Ephraim like a physical blow. He stared at his bowl, throat tight, unable to meet her eyes. "Now, Susan," he managed finally, "this here's just temporary, you understand? Until we can sort things properly." She nodded quickly, ducking her head to hide whatever emotion crossed her face. They ate in silence after that, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the distant lowing of cattle. After supper, Ephraim retreated to his usual evening routine, grateful for the familiar motions. He sat by the lamp's glow, working saddle leather through his hands as he mended a worn piece of tack. The regular movement of needle and thread helped steady his thoughts. From the corner of his eye, he watched Susan prepare for bed. She changed into a nightdress behind the privacy screen he'd rigged from an old quilt, then knelt beside her cot to pray. Her mother's sealed letter remained clutched in one hand, pressed against her heart as she whispered words too quiet to hear. When she finally lay down, curled small beneath the blankets with the letter held close, Ephraim felt something shift in his chest. She looked so young, so alone, yet there was a strength in her that reminded him of someone. His late wife had faced life with that same quiet determination. Sleep refused to come, as Ephraim lay in his own bed, staring at the cabin's low ceiling. Already he could hear the whispers that would spread through town. A single man with a young girl in his home. No proper explanation to satisfy the gossips. The preacher's wife would purse her lips, the store owner would raise his eyebrows, and soon enough someone would decide to do something about the situation. For the first time since Martha died, Ephraim felt words of prayer rising in his throat. Not the formal prayers of Sunday service, but something raw and honest. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I don't know what I'm doing here. But if you sent this child my way, I sure could use some guidance." The cabin creaked softly in response, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Susan's steady breathing filled the quiet space between his words and whatever answer might come. She still held that letter, even in sleep, as if it contained all the answers they both needed. The rooster's crow pierced the dawn, its sound carrying across the quiet homestead. Inside the cabin, Susan stirred before Ephraim could wake her. He found her already dressed, standing uncertainly by the stove. "May I help with breakfast, sir?" she asked, smoothing her apron. Ephraim nodded slowly. "Reckon you can stir the porridge while I check on the animals." When he returned from feeding the horses, the smell of slightly scorched oats filled the cabin. Susan stood on tiptoe at the stove, wooden spoon clutched determinedly in her small hand. "I'm sorry it's a bit burned," she said quickly. "I'll do better tomorrow." "No matter," Ephraim replied, spooning his portion into a bowl. "Food's food." After breakfast, Susan followed him outside like a shadow. The morning air was crisp, heavy with dew, and wisps of fog still clung to the valley floor. Chickens scratched in the dirt, pecking hopefully at their feet. "Could I gather the eggs?" Susan asked. "Mom taught me how." Ephraim handed her a small basket. "Mind the mean red hen. She's fierce about her nest." Susan approached the henhouse with careful steps. She spoke softly to each chicken, her voice gentle as she reached beneath them. One egg, then another, found its way into her basket. When the red hen puffed up and clucked threateningly, Susan didn't flinch. She just waited, speaking quiet words until the hen settled. "7 eggs," she announced proudly, presenting the basket to Ephraim. He couldn't help but notice how her face glowed with accomplishment. "Not bad," he allowed. "Cow needs milking next." Susan's confidence wavered slightly at the sight of the large Holstein, but she squared her shoulders and approached the milk stool. Her small hands struggled with the unfamiliar motion of milking, and more milk splashed on her shoes than in the bucket. "Like this," Ephraim demonstrated, his weathered hands showing the proper grip and rhythm. "Gentle but firm." Susan tried again, her tongue poking out in concentration. The milk finally began to flow steadily, pinging against the bucket's metal sides. "I'm doing it!" she exclaimed. A smile tugged at Ephraim's mouth before he caught himself. "Can't get attached," he reminded himself firmly. This arrangement wasn't permanent. By midday, the morning chores were done. Susan had helped feed the chickens, sweep the cabin, and even attempted to make the beds, though her corners weren't quite square. Now she sat in the wagon beside him, her mother's letter safely tucked in her pocket as they headed toward town. The main street of Silver Creek came into view, a single dirt road lined with false-fronted buildings. As their wagon rumbled past the livery stable, heads turned. Women in dusty bonnets paused their shopping to stare. Ephraim felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. "Land sakes, is that Cole with a child?" Mrs. Peterson's loud whisper carried clearly from the millinery shop porch. "It ain't proper," another woman declared, shaking her head. "A single man with a young girl? Someone ought to speak to the sheriff." Susan sat straighter beside him, her chin lifted despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Ephraim found himself admiring her courage even as his jaw clenched at the gossip. They pulled up in front of the mercantile, its wooden sidewalk creaking under their boots. The station master, Mr. Jenkins, stood behind the counter, his round spectacles glinting in the dusty sunlight that streamed through the windows. "Ah, Cole," Jenkins said, his voice careful. "I've already sent word to the Denver orphanage. They'll send someone for the girl tomorrow." "Now hold on," Ephraim started, but Susan stepped forward, pulling the sealed envelope from her pocket. "Please, sir," she said clearly, though her voice trembled slightly. "My mother left this for Mr. Cole." The letter was creased from being held close, but the seal remained unbroken. Ephraim took it carefully, aware of the watching eyes of townspeople who had filtered into the store. The paper crackled as he broke the seal and unfolded the pages. The handwriting was delicate but determined, even though the letters wavered in places, the mark of someone writing through great difficulty. Ephraim began to read. "Dear Mr. Cole, I write this knowing I will not live to meet you in person. Consumption has taken hold too deeply, and my time grows short. But I must make one final request, not as your intended bride, but as a mother desperate to secure her daughter's future. I have heard of you from others who passed through Denver. They spoke of your honor, your kindness to strangers, and how you've faced your own griefs with dignity. I know I ask much, perhaps too much, but I beg you to consider taking Susan as your daughter. She is a good girl, skilled with household tasks despite her age, and her heart is pure. She knows her Bible and her letters, and she will work hard to be worthy of a home. I would not ask this if I had any other choice, but I have no family left to care for her. If you cannot find it in your heart to be her father, I understand. But please, see her safely to someone who will love her as I have. With hope and gratitude, Margaret May." Ephraim's hands shook slightly as he lowered the letter. The store had gone quiet, every ear straining to hear what was written. He looked at Susan, standing brave and straight despite her trembling lip, and saw something of her mother's determination in her stance. "Well?" Jenkins prompted, adjusting his spectacles. "What does it say?" Before Ephraim could answer, the door chimes jangled. Mrs. Whitaker, head of the Ladies' Aid Society, swept in with several other women in tow. Their faces were set with righteous purpose. "This simply won't do," Mrs. Whitaker announced. "A single man cannot raise a young girl. Think of propriety. Think of what people will say." "It ain't proper," echoed Mrs. Peterson. "The child needs a woman's guidance." "The orphanage is the only sensible solution," another woman added firmly. Susan's hands clenched into small fists at her sides, but she held her tears in check. Ephraim found himself standing straighter, the letter still warm in his hands. The trust of a dying mother weighed heavy on his conscience. How had Margaret May known of him? What tales of his character had reached her ears, that she would entrust him with her most precious possession? The townspeople's murmurs grew louder, a rising tide of speculation and judgment. Some spoke of scandal, others of moral duty. A few suggested sending for the preacher to weigh in on the matter. "Now see here," Ephraim began, but his words were drowned in the swell of voices as more townspeople crowded into the store, drawn by the commotion. The whispers grew to a dull roar. "What's he thinking? Poor child. Someone must do something. It just ain't right." The wagon wheels creaked as Ephraim guided the horses away from town, leaving the whispers and judgment behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rutted road. Susan sat quietly beside him, her small hands folded in her lap, the Bible tucked safely beside her. After a mile of silence, Susan's voice came soft as a dove's wing. "Mr. Cole? Could I ask about your wife?" Ephraim's hands tightened on the reins. No one in town dared mention Sarah anymore. They knew better. But looking at Susan's earnest face, he saw only gentle curiosity, not the usual pity that made his throat close up. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally, his voice rough. "She loved springtime best, said the wild violets reminded her of home back east." The wagon rocked over a stone, and Susan waited patiently for him to continue. "Fever took her. 3 years ago now." His words came slowly, like water from a deep well. "We'd been married 5 years. She was..." He swallowed hard. "She was carrying our first child when it happened." Susan's small hand touched his arm, light as a feather. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole." Mama always said loss was God's hardest test of faith. Ephraim nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The familiar ache in his chest felt different somehow, shared with this child who knew her own kind of grief. "I could help make the cabin warm again," Susan offered quietly. "I know how to bake bread, and I can learn to make quilts like Mama taught me." She said a home needs gentle touches to make it sing. Something caught in Ephraim's throat at her words. Sarah had said similar things, back when they'd first built the cabin. He'd forgotten how the house used to smell of fresh bread and cedar boughs. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, the horses' hooves marking time against the dusty road. The sun was setting by the time they reached the homestead, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Ephraim built up the fire, while Susan set about making supper. She moved around the kitchen with careful purpose, measuring cornmeal and stirring the pot of venison stew he'd left simmering that morning. The familiar domestic sounds, spoon against pot, kindling crackling, water being poured, filled the cabin with a homey feeling he hadn't experienced in years. They had just finished their supper when heavy knocking rattled the door. Susan jumped, her spoon clattering against her bowl. Ephraim rose slowly, recognizing the authoritative rhythm of those knocks. 3 figures stood on his porch in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Whitaker from the Ladies' Aid Society, Judge Morton with his silver beard catching the last light, and Reverend Hayes, his usual friendly expression replaced by stern gravity. "Evening, Cole," Judge Morton said, his voice formal. "May we come in?" Ephraim stepped back, allowing them to enter. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes swept the cabin, noting Susan's presence at the table, the 2 bowls of stew, the girl's trunk in the corner. "Mr. Cole," Reverend Hayes began, clearing his throat, "we've come on serious business." The town council met in emergency session this afternoon. Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, her face set in lines of righteous concern. "This situation cannot continue without proper documentation. A single man cannot simply take in a young girl without legal standing. Think of the implications." "The law is clear," Judge Morton added, his tone heavy with authority. "Either you must prove legal guardianship through proper papers, or the child must be placed with the Women's Benevolent Society until suitable arrangements can be made." Susan rose from her chair, moving to stand beside Ephraim. Her small hand found his arm again, holding tight. "You have 1 week," Mrs. Whitaker declared. 1 week to produce documentation of guardianship, or we'll have no choice but to remove the child. For her own good, you understand?" Ephraim felt Susan's grip tighten. "I have her mother's letter," he said, reaching for the paper in his coat pocket. Judge Morton shook his head. "A letter isn't legal documentation, Cole. You need proper guardianship papers, signed and witnessed. Otherwise, the law is clear." 1 week, Reverend Hayes repeated, his voice gentler than the others. "We're trying to be reasonable here, Ephraim. Give you time to do things properly." Mrs. Whitaker's skirts rustled as she turned toward the door. "We'll expect to see you at the town council meeting next Thursday. Either with papers in hand, or—" She left the alternative unspoken, but her meaning was clear. The 3 council members filed out into the night. Their footsteps echoed on the porch boards, then crunched in the gravel as they made their way to their waiting buggy. Ephraim stood in the doorway until the sound of wheels and hooves faded into darkness. When he finally closed the door, the cabin seemed too quiet. Susan hadn't moved from his side, her face pale in the lamplight. "Please don't let them take me away," she whispered. Ephraim couldn't find words to answer. He moved to his chair by the fire, sinking into it heavily. The law was the law. He knew that. But the thought of sending this child away, breaking the trust her mother had placed in him, his conscience warred with the reality of his situation. The soft scrape of chair legs drew his attention. Susan had pulled her seat close to the fire, a piece of mending in her lap. In the flickering light, he watched as she threaded a needle and began carefully stitching a tear in one of his work shirts. Her small fingers moved surely, just as they had with the morning's chores. Each stitch was neat and even, pulled tight with care. The sight struck him hard. How many evenings had Sarah sat in that very spot, mending by firelight? The familiar ache in his chest twisted with something new, a warmth he hadn't expected, hadn't wanted to feel. Susan worked quietly, her head bent over the shirt. She belonged there, he realized with a start. In just 2 days, she had carved out a place for herself in his home, filling empty corners with purpose and life. But the council's words echoed in his mind, bringing a cold dread that settled in his stomach like lead. 1 week, 7 days to either find a way to keep her or watch her be taken away. 7 days to choose between defying the law or betraying a dying woman's trust. The fire crackled softly. Susan's needle flashed in the lamplight, binding torn edges together with patient care. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering night, its lonely song floating across the darkened prairie. Dawn painted the sky in soft rose and gold as Ephraim hitched the wagon. Susan stood nearby, clutching her slate and primer, watching his practiced movements with quiet attention. The morning air held the crisp bite of early autumn, making their breath visible in small puffs. "Miss Redbird's mighty kind to see us so early," Ephraim said, adjusting the harness. He'd heard good things about the Cherokee schoolteacher, how she treated every child with patience, whether from town families or outlying homesteads. "Will she like me?" Susan asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Reckon she will." Ephraim lifted her onto the wagon seat. "Folks say she's got a gift for teaching young ones." The wagon wheels creaked as they made their way into town. Main Street was just coming alive, shopkeepers sweeping porches, the blacksmith stoking his forge. A few early risers nodded cautiously to Ephraim, their eyes lingering on Susan with poorly hidden curiosity. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a weathered building with fresh whitewash gleaming in the morning light. Naomi Redbird stood in the doorway, her dark hair neatly braided, wearing a simple calico dress. Her warm smile welcomed them before she spoke. "Good morning, Mr. Cole." Her voice carried both strength and gentleness. "And this must be Susan May." She extended her hand to help the girl down from the wagon. Susan bobbed a polite curtsy. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Redbird." "Come inside, both of you. I've coffee brewing, and there's plenty of time before my other students arrive." The schoolroom was tidy and bright, with sunshine streaming through clean windows. Rows of wooden desks faced a large slate board, and colorful maps decorated the walls. Susan's eyes widened at the sight of books lined neatly on shelves. "Why don't you try out the slate while Mr. Cole and I talk?" Naomi suggested, handing Susan a piece of chalk. The girl settled happily at a front desk, carefully forming letters as she'd been taught by her mother. Naomi poured coffee into tin cups, her movements graceful and measured. "You should know what you're facing, Mr. Cole," she said quietly, leading him to her desk. "This town holds tight to its judgments." Ephraim nodded, warming his hands around the cup. "Been feeling that since Susan arrived. They whisper about me too, the Cherokee woman teaching their children." A hint of sadness crossed her face. "Some parents withdrew their children when I was hired, but others stood firm, seeing past fear to what matters." She glanced at Susan, absorbed in her slate work. "That child needs education, Mr. Cole. I'd be honored to teach her." "Much obliged," Ephraim said softly. "Truth is, I'm not sure how long." He trailed off, unable to voice his fears about the council's deadline. Naomi's dark eyes held understanding. Each day carries its own blessing. "We'll start there." They worked out a schedule. Susan would come 3 mornings each week, joining the regular classes, Naomi would assign extra work to help her catch up to children her age. That evening, after supper was cleared away, Ephraim sat with Susan at the kitchen table. Lamplight cast their shadows on the wall as they bent over her primer. A is for apple, Susan recited carefully. B is for bread. Her finger traced each letter as she spoke. Good, Ephraim encouraged, surprised by how much he enjoyed these quiet lessons. Sarah had always wanted children to teach. The thought came unbidden, bringing its familiar ache. Days settled into rhythm like wheel ruts in a well-traveled road. Each morning brought chores, feeding chickens, milking the cow, gathering eggs. Susan threw herself into the work with cheerful determination, her small hands growing steadier with practice. 3 mornings a week, they'd ride to town for lessons. Naomi's patience never wavered as she guided Susan through sums and letters. Other students gradually accepted the newcomer, sharing slate pencils and jumping rope at recess. Evenings filled with simple comfort, lessons reviewed by lamplight, Bible stories read aloud, quiet songs as Susan helped with mending or shelling peas. She had a sweet, clear voice that reminded Ephraim of meadowlarks in spring. One night, as he sat in his chair by the fire, Susan's voice drifted from her corner where she prepared for bed. The tune caught his attention, making his heart stutter. Sarah's favorite lullaby, one she'd learned from her mother back east. Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee all through the night. The familiar melody wrapped around him like a physical thing. Sarah had sung it countless evenings, her voice warm and true, dreaming of the baby they'd planned to have. Now Susan's innocent singing brought it all rushing back, hope and love and devastating loss. Ephraim stood abruptly, needing air. The night sky spread vast above him as he stepped onto the porch, stars scattered like diamond dust across black velvet. His chest felt too tight, grief rising fresh as yesterday. But this time, something else rose with it. Susan's voice continued softly inside, pure and sweet as spring water. The song that had been silence for 3 years lived again, carrying not just memories of loss, but whispers of healing. Tears finally came, quiet and cleansing. He leaned against the porch post, letting them fall as the lullaby wound gentle fingers through his pain. When had this orphan girl begun filling the hollow places in his heart? How had she known exactly the song to sing? The screen door creaked. Small footsteps approached, and a warm hand slipped into his. "Are you sad, Mr. Cole?" Susan asked softly. He squeezed her hand gently. "Not exactly, little one. That song, my Sarah used to sing it. Mama taught it to me. She said good songs belong to everybody who needs them." Ephraim looked down at her serious face, silvered by starlight. "Your mama was a wise woman." They stood together, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain. From somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound answered by another voice, creating harmony across the empty miles. "Reckon it's past bedtime," Ephraim said finally. But before they went in, he found himself humming the old lullaby's chorus. Susan's clear voice joined his, and for the first time in 3 years, music filled the night air around the lonely cabin. Hope, Ephraim realized, could sneak up quiet as a sunrise, warming the cold places when you least expected it. This child had brought more than responsibility to his door. She'd brought the possibility of healing, of family, of love restored. Inside, he tucked her blanket close and touched her hair softly. "Sleep well, Susan May." "Good night." She hesitated, then whispered, "Papa." The word settled in his heart like a seed taking root. Whatever challenges lay ahead with the town council, he knew this much was true. Susan had awakened something he'd thought forever lost. Not just memories of Sarah, but the courage to love again, to risk his heart for family. He sat by the dying fire long after Susan's breathing settled into sleep. remembering Sarah's dreams of filling this cabin with children's laughter. Perhaps she'd known somehow, guided this motherless child to his door. The thought brought comfort instead of pain, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across the churchyard as Ephraim helped Susan down from the wagon. She wore her best dress, freshly pressed the night before, and clutched her mother's Bible close. Ephraim straightened his tie, conscious of the eyes following their every move. They climbed the wooden steps together, boots echoing on the planks. Inside, the familiar scent of beeswax and pine filled the air. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like golden snow. But the peaceful scene was marred by the buzz of whispers that spread through the pews like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Blake, both widows of respected ranchers, huddled together in their usual spot near the front. Their bonnets bobbed as they bent close, voices carrying just loud enough for intent to be clear, if not words. Living alone with a child? Hardly proper. What would his poor wife think? Susan's shoulders tensed as she slid into the pew beside Ephraim. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder, steering her gaze toward the cross above the pulpit instead of the judgmental faces around them. The organ wheezed to life, and the congregation rose for the first hymn. Susan's clear voice joined the singing, though Ephraim noticed her hands trembled slightly as they held the hymnal. Throughout the service, the undercurrent of murmurs continued like an angry stream beneath river ice. Pastor Matthews delivered his sermon on mercy and judgment, his words seeming to fall on deaf ears as more than one head turned to cast pointed looks at Ephraim and Susan. The irony wasn't lost on Ephraim, who kept his eyes steadily forward, jaw set against the rising tide of gossip. After the final "Amen," people filed out slowly, forming their usual clusters for Sunday conversation. Ephraim guided Susan toward the door, hoping to make a quick escape, but Pastor Matthews intercepted them with a concerned smile. "Brother Cole, might I have a word?" The pastor gestured toward his study. "Susan can wait here by the door." Inside the small room lined with books, Pastor Matthews cleared his throat. "Ephraim, you know I respect your judgment, but there's been considerable discussion among the congregation." Ephraim's boots shifted on the worn floorboards. "Reckon I noticed that?" "Several of our most respected church ladies have expressed willingness to take Susan in." The pastor's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Henderson, in particular, has experience with young girls. It would be a more conventional arrangement." "With all due respect, Pastor," Ephraim said quietly, "Susan's mother trusted her to my care. I aim to honor that trust. I understand your position, but consider what's best for the child. A growing girl needs proper feminine guidance." Before Ephraim could respond, a muffled sob caught his attention. Through the study window, he glimpsed Susan's small figure hurrying down the church steps. She'd overheard everything. "Excuse me, Pastor," Ephraim said shortly, already moving toward the door. He found her by the hitching post, face pressed against the rough wood, shoulders shaking with quiet tears. His heart clenched at the sight. Kneeling beside her, he placed a gentle hand on her back. "Hey now, little one," he said softly. "No need for tears." Susan turned to him, her face streaked with moisture. "Please don't send me away," she whispered. "I'll be good, I promise. I'll work harder." "Listen here, Susan May." Ephraim's voice was firm but tender. "You're not going anywhere. I made a promise to your mama, and I aim to keep it. More than that." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You belong with me now. We're family." She threw her arms around his neck, clinging tight. Over her shoulder, Ephraim saw several church ladies watching disapprovingly, but he didn't care. He helped Susan into the wagon and turned toward home, leaving the whispers behind. Back at the cabin, They threw themselves into work, as if physical labor could drive away the morning's troubles. Susan helped gather eggs and feed the chickens, while Ephraim checked on the pregnant ewes. Lambing season was approaching, and several of the sheep were heavy with young. "Looks like this one might birth twins," he told Susan as she peered over the fence at a particularly round ewe. The animal's sides heaved with careful breathing, her eyes calm and knowing. They were preparing the birthing pen when hoofbeats announced a visitor. Naomi Redbird rode up on her bay mare, a covered basket balanced carefully before her. "Thought you might enjoy some company," she called out, swinging down from her saddle. The rich smell of fresh-baked apple pie drifted from her basket. "And I brought some new readers for Susan's lessons." Susan's face brightened as she ran to greet her teacher. Naomi's visits had become a welcome brightness in their weeks, her quiet strength and wisdom a balm to their spirits. They settled around the kitchen table, sharing pie and conversation. Naomi listened intently as Ephraim described the morning's events at church. "The law may not be on your side," she said thoughtfully, "but there's a higher justice at work here." Her dark eyes held conviction. "I've seen how Susan thrives with you, Ephraim. Sometimes the right path isn't the easy one." "Miss Redbird?" Susan spoke up, her voice small but determined. "I'm going to work extra hard at my lessons. And help more with the lambs. Then maybe they'll see I belong here." Naomi smiled warmly. "You already belong here, little one. Sometimes others just take time to see what's right in front of them." They spent the afternoon together, Naomi helping Susan with her reading while Ephraim tended to outdoor chores. The cabin felt warmer somehow with her presence, as if her quiet confidence drove back the shadows of doubt the morning had brought. As evening approached, Naomi mounted her horse to leave. "Remember," she told Ephraim, "faith isn't just about believing, it's about persisting when the path grows hard." After she rode away, Ephraim and Susan prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. When they sat down to eat, Susan bowed her head, folding her hands with careful reverence. "Dear Lord," she prayed, her voice clear and earnest, "thank you for this food. Thank you for Mr. Cole, Papa, and for Miss Redbird. Please help the church people understand that this is where I belong, and please bless the lambs that are coming. Amen." Ephraim watched her, throat tight with emotion. The simple faith in her prayer, the trust in her voice. It humbled him. Here was this child, facing uncertainty and judgment, yet still holding fast to hope and gratitude. His own head bowed, not in prayer exactly, but in recognition of something profound. The whispers and disapproval of others seemed to fade against the quiet strength of Susan's belief. Whatever challenges lay ahead with the town council, he knew they would face them together. They ate their supper in comfortable silence as twilight gathered outside the windows. From the barn came the occasional bleat of sheep, reminding them that new life was on its way, ready to arrive, despite what anyone might think about proper timing or circumstances. Later, as Ephraim tucked a quilt around Susan's shoulders, she murmured sleepily, "We're going to be all right, aren't we, Papa?" "Yes, little one," he answered, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "We surely are." Dawn broke over the homestead in gentle waves of pink and gold. Ephraim stood at the cabin door, watching Susan hurry toward the chicken coop, her small boots leaving tracks in the morning dew. The air held the fresh promise of spring, tinged with the earthy scent of warming soil. "Eggs are still warm," Susan called out, carefully placing each one in her gathered apron. Her face glowed with pride at completing her first morning task. Ephraim nodded approvingly. "Much obliged, Susan. After breakfast, we've got fence mending to tend to." They shared a quick meal of cornmeal mush and coffee, milk for Susan, before heading out to tackle the day's work. The winter had been hard on the split-rail fences, leaving several sections askew or broken entirely. "Hand me that length of twine," Ephraim directed, showing Susan how to secure the rails where they crossed. Her small fingers proved nimble with the rough cord, tying knots that would hold firm against wind and weather. "Like this?" she asked, demonstrating the technique he'd shown her. "That's just right." He watched her work, noting how she threw herself into each task with quiet determination. No complaints passed her lips, even when the spring sun climbed higher and sweat dampened her collar. By mid-morning, they moved to the vegetable patch behind the cabin. Ephraim demonstrated how to prepare the soil, turning it with the spade while Susan followed behind, breaking up clumps with her hands and removing stones. "These rows need to be straight as an arrow," he explained, stretching twine between stakes. "Seeds like order, same as people do." Susan nodded seriously, carefully placing each seed according to his instructions, corn, beans, and squash in their proper spaces. Her dedication to the task reminded him of his late wife's careful gardening, bringing an unexpected ache to his chest. Their peaceful routine was interrupted by an urgent bleating from the barn. Ephraim recognized the sound immediately, a ewe in labor. They hurried to the birthing pen he'd prepared days earlier. The ewe lay on her side in the fresh straw, sides heaving with effort. Susan pressed close to the pen's rail, eyes wide with concern and wonder. "Is she hurting?" she whispered. "It's hard work bringing new life," Ephraim explained gently, "but it's natural as breathing. We just need to watch and help if needed." They waited together as the ewe labored, Susan occasionally murmuring soft encouragement. When the lamb finally emerged, it was smaller than usual, its wool matted and trembling. "Something's not right," Ephraim muttered, reaching for the weak creature. The mother ewe seemed too exhausted to tend to it properly. "Please," Susan pleaded, "can we take it inside?" "Just until it's stronger?" Her eyes held such earnest concern that Ephraim found himself nodding. They carried the lamb to the cabin, Susan already gathering clean rags. She sat cross-legged before the hearth, cradling the tiny creature while Ephraim built up the fire. "It needs milk," she declared, dipping a clean rag in warm milk from their morning's milking. With infinite patience, she let the lamb suckle the milk-soaked cloth, drop by precious drop. Hours passed as Susan tended the lamb. She hardly moved from her post, speaking softly to the trembling creature, rubbing its sides to encourage strength. Ephraim watched between his outdoor chores, something warming in his chest at the sight of such tender care. As afternoon faded toward evening, the lamb finally struggled to its feet, wobbling but determined. Susan's laugh of delight filled the cabin, the first real laugh Ephraim had heard from her since her arrival. Tears sparkled in her eyes as the lamb butted its head against her hand, seeking more milk. "Look, Papa," she exclaimed, then caught herself, blushing at the slip. But Ephraim only smiled, his own eyes suspiciously moist. The sound of hoofbeats announced Naomi's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene. Susan on the floor with the lamb, Ephraim watching from his chair, the whole cabin warmed by firelight and shared purpose. "Well now," Naomi said, her dark eyes twinkling. "What's this?" Susan eagerly explained about the lamb's rescue while Naomi listened, nodding with understanding. From her satchel, she produced books, a primer, and a worn Bible. "I thought we might continue your lessons," she suggested, "though it seems you've learned quite a bit about nurturing life today already." They cleared space at the table, the lamb sleeping contentedly in its box nearby. Naomi opened the primer, her finger tracking beneath the words as Susan read aloud. Her voice grew stronger with each line, confidence building as Naomi offered gentle corrections and praise. Ephraim found himself drawn to watch them, his mending forgotten in his lap. Naomi's patience matched Susan's eagerness to learn, creating a harmony he hadn't expected. The lamplight caught copper highlights in Naomi's dark hair as she bent over the book, her smile warm and encouraging. When they turned to scripture, Susan's face lit up with recognition. "Mama taught me this one," she said, carefully reading the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Naomi's voice joined hers for the familiar words, their different tones blending like music. Even the lamb seemed to listen, lifting its head at the sound of their voices. As they read and worked simple arithmetic problems, Ephraim felt something shift in his heart, like spring soil finally thawing after a long winter. Here in his cabin, once so empty of life and hope, something new was taking root. He watched Susan count sums on her fingers while Naomi nodded encouragement. Watched Naomi's gentle hands guide Susan's letters on the slate. Watched them share smiles over small victories, their heads bent together in the lamp's golden glow. A family, he thought suddenly. Not the one he'd expected, but something just as precious. Built not on blood or legal papers, but on shared faith, shared labor, and the simple act of choosing to care for one another. The lamb bleated softly from its box, as if in agreement. Susan hurried to check on it, her face aglow with achievement, both from her lessons and her role as caretaker. Naomi rose to help her prepare more milk, their movements around his kitchen somehow natural, as if they'd always belonged there. Ephraim remained in his chair, watching this tableau of domestic peace unfold. The town council's deadline still loomed, but in this moment, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would fight to keep this unexpected gift of family that had arrived at his door in ways he never could have predicted. The evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket, filled with the soft sounds of Susan's reading, Naomi's gentle corrections, and the contented noises of a lamb brought back to life by a child's determined love. Outside, the spring wind whispered promises of growth and renewal across the waiting fields. 2 days after the lamb's rescue, spring sunshine warmed the worn wooden steps of the town hall. Ephraim guided Susan up those steps, his hand steady on her shoulder. She clutched her mother's Bible close, its leather cover smooth from years of devotional reading. Inside, lamplight cast long shadows across the meeting room's plank floors. The council members sat in judgment behind a long table, 3 stern-faced men and 2 of the town's most prominent widows. Their expressions reminded Ephraim of storm clouds gathering before a tempest. Wooden chairs scraped against the floor as townsfolk filed in, drawn by curiosity and concern. Susan pressed closer to Ephraim's side as whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. He noticed how small she looked, how vulnerable, yet her chin remained lifted with quiet dignity. "This hearing will come to order," announced Mr. Peterson, the council head. His gavel struck wood with sharp authority. "We're here to address the matter of the child Susan May, currently residing without proper guardianship at the Cole homestead." Ephraim felt Susan's slight flinch at the words, "without proper guardianship." He squeezed her shoulder gently, steadying them both. Mrs. Whitaker, one of the widow council members, spoke first. Her voice carried the weight of moral certainty. "It's simply not proper. A single man raising a young girl. What will people think? What sort of example does it set?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Susan's fingers tightened on her Bible until her knuckles showed white. "I've heard tell she's doing men's work out there," another woman called from the audience. "Mending fences, working with livestock. It ain't natural for a young lady." "And who's seeing to her education?" Mrs. Whitaker pressed. "Her moral instruction? Her preparation for proper womanhood." Before Ephraim could respond, Naomi Redbird rose from her seat near the front. Her dark eyes held steady as she addressed the council. "I can speak to the child's education." A few disapproving mutters followed her words, but Mr. Peterson nodded for her to continue. "Susan studies with me every afternoon," Naomi stated clearly. "She's bright and eager to learn. Her reading improves daily, and she has a particular gift for scripture memorization. Moreover, she shows remarkable character, diligence, compassion, and faith beyond her years." Mrs. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. With all due respect to Miss Redbird, this goes beyond education. A child needs a proper home, a proper family. The Women's Society in Denver has connections to several fine orphanages. No! Susan's voice rang out, surprising everyone. She stood, trembling but determined. Please don't send me away. Mr. Cole, he takes good care of me. We pray together, and he teaches me about the land, and her voice caught, but she pressed on. My mama knew he was honorable. That's why she trusted him with me. Silence fell across the room. Ephraim felt pride surge in his chest at her courage, even as worry gnawed at him. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. While the child's attachment is touching, we must consider legal requirements, without proper documentation of guardianship. Then let me apply for it properly, Ephraim interrupted, standing beside Susan. Give me time to petition the circuit judge. The council members exchanged glances. Finally, Mr. Peterson spoke again. The circuit judge is due through these parts in 2 weeks' time. Until then, nothing changes, Ephraim stated firmly. Susan stays with me. You've seen no evidence of neglect or impropriety. She's well fed, educated, and cared for. And what of her soul's care? Mrs. Whitaker demanded. A child needs a mother's guidance. She has mine, Naomi spoke up again, moving to stand beside Susan. I spend time with her daily, helping guide her development as any woman would. This declaration caused another stir among the townsfolk. Ephraim noticed several heads shaking, lips pursed in disapproval. The idea of a Cherokee schoolteacher helping raise a white child clearly disturbed their sensibilities. Mr. Peterson raised his hands for quiet. The matter will be settled by the circuit judge. Until then, we'll assign Mrs. Whitaker to make weekly checks on the child's welfare. The gavel fell again, concluding the hearing. As people began to file out, Ephraim felt the weight of their stares, heard the whispered conversations they weren't meant to hear. Exploitation, pure and simple. Using that poor child for free labor? And that Indian woman involved, too. The wagon ride home passed in heavy silence. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, their hooves striking the packed earth with muted thuds. Susan sat close to Ephraim, her Bible still clutched tight, but her earlier courage had drained away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Evening settled over the homestead like a thick blanket. After a quiet supper of beans and cornbread, Susan went through her usual routine, helping with dishes, feeding the rescued lamb, preparing for bed. But Ephraim noticed her movements were mechanical, her usual cheerful spirit dimmed. As she lay on her cot, the lamp's flame casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, she finally broke. Tears slid down her cheeks as she curled around her mother's Bible. "They're going to send me away," she whispered, voice cracking. "Just like Mama said might happen. She told me to be brave, but—" A sob caught in her throat. Ephraim moved from his chair, kneeling beside her cot. His rough hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Susan, look at me." She turned tear-filled eyes to his face. "I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to keep you here. Everything." His voice grew hoarse with emotion. "You belong here now, with the land, with the animals, with me." Susan sniffled, wiping her eyes with her free hand. But what if the judge says no? Ephraim was quiet for a moment. Then, surprising himself as much as her, he said, "Let's pray about it." Her eyes widened slightly. She'd never heard him pray aloud before, though she knew he attended church and read his Bible privately. Ephraim cleared his throat, clasping her small hand in both of his weathered ones. "Lord," he began hesitantly, then with growing strength, "we come before you tonight with heavy hearts. You know the truth of our situation. You know how this child has brought life back to this home, how she tends your creatures with love, how she honors her mother's memory with her faith and courage." Susan's fingers tightened around his as he continued. We ask for your will to be done, Lord. Give us strength for whatever comes. Help us trust in your wisdom and timing. And, his voice roughened with emotion, if it be your will, let us remain together as family. Amen, Susan whispered, a faint smile touching her lips despite her tears. Ephraim tucked the quilt around her shoulders, his touch gentle as a father's. He watched as her breathing slowly steadied into sleep, her face peaceful despite the day's troubles. The lamp burned low as he sat beside her cot, lost in thought. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the prairie night, and somewhere in the barn, the rescued lamb bleated softly. All these sounds, the child's breathing, the animals, the wind in the eaves, had become the music of his home. The thought of silence returning, of emptiness filling these walls again, made his chest ache with a pain sharper than any physical wound. He looked down at Susan's sleeping face, seeing in it both the ghost of her mother's trust and the promise of future joy. Whatever came next, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would fight for this unexpected gift of family that Providence had delivered to his door. The days crept forward like molasses in winter. Every morning, the sun rose over Ephraim's homestead, painting the weathered fence posts in golden light while roosters called the world to wake. Yet beneath the routine of ranch life, tension hummed like a tight-drawn wire. Susan threw herself into chores with fierce determination. Her small hands worked quickly, gathering eggs without breaking a single shell, measuring feed for the horses with careful precision. Sometimes Ephraim caught her whispering to the animals, making promises that she would stay to care for them. "Don't you worry, lady," she told the speckled hen one morning, her voice carrying across the yard. "I'll always be here to gather your eggs." The words made Ephraim's chest tighten as he mended a broken harness nearby. Naomi visited every afternoon, bringing not just school books, but also words of encouragement wrapped in scripture. She sat at their rough-hewn table, her dark eyes warm as she opened her Bible. "Remember Joshua's courage," she said one day, her finger tracing the verses. "The Lord told him to be strong and of good courage, for he would not fail nor forsake him." Susan nodded solemnly, absorbing every word. But it was Ephraim who felt the scripture's weight settle into his bones. He hadn't thought much about Joshua before, a man facing impossible odds, standing firm because God commanded it. The garden required constant attention as spring strengthened its hold. Susan worked beside Ephraim, her sunbonnet bobbing as she pulled weeds from between the tender vegetable shoots. Her small hands matched his movements, though she had to rest more often. "We'll have fresh peas soon," she declared, brushing dirt from her apron, "and the tomatoes are growing strong." She spoke of future harvests with such certainty that Ephraim had to turn away, blinking hard at the sunshine. One quiet afternoon, as clouds gathered promising rain, Susan discovered the old rocking chair in the barn's loft. It was his wife's chair, stored away after her passing because the sight of it empty had hurt too much. "Could we fix it?" Susan asked, running her hand along the dusty wood. "It needs love, is all." Ephraim studied the chair, seeing beyond its current state to what it could become. "Reckon we could," he said slowly. "Need to sand it down proper first." They brought the chair into the yard, and Ephraim showed Susan how to sand with the grain, smoothing away years of neglect. She worked with careful focus, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "This will be my forever chair," she announced suddenly, looking up at him with those clear, trusting eyes. "For reading and sewing and watching sunsets. Forever and ever." Ephraim had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "That's a mighty long time," he managed. "That's right," she agreed firmly, returning to her sanding, "because this is my forever home, too." That evening, after supper was cleared and the animals settled for the night, Susan brought out her mother's Bible. The leather was worn soft with use, the pages marked with pressed flowers and carefully written notes in the margins. "Would you read?" she asked, holding it out to him. "Mama always said scripture sounds different when it's shared." Ephraim took the Bible carefully, aware of its precious weight. He opened to where a dried wildflower marked the page and began reading about God setting the solitary in families, about his father heart toward the fatherless. The words caught in his throat, speaking straight to their situation. Susan leaned against his arm, her eyes closed in contentment. The lamplight cast soft shadows across her face, making her look younger than her 9 years. Ephraim read on, discovering verses he'd never truly noticed before. Promises about adoption into God's family, about his care for those who care for others. That night, sleep came easier than it had since the council's decree. The Bible's words seemed to hover in the cabin's darkness, offering comfort like a warm blanket. Sunday arrived clear and bright. The little church's white clapboard walls gleamed in the morning sun as wagons and riders gathered for service. Ephraim helped Susan down from their wagon, noting how she'd carefully smoothed her best dress and tied her hair ribbon just so. Inside, the familiar scents of wood polish and hymnal leather wrapped around them. They took their usual pew, aware of the glances cast their way. But something had shifted in the congregation's attitude. Perhaps it was seeing them there every Sunday, faithful despite the whispers. Perhaps it was watching Susan's eager participation in the children's Bible recitation, or noting how she helped the younger ones with their verses. The pastor stood to deliver his sermon, his worn Bible open before him. "Today," he began, "we'll speak about family. Not just the families we're born into, but the families God builds through love and choice." Ephraim felt Susan grow still beside him. The pastor's words rolled out across the congregation, speaking of Abraham's adoption of Lot, of Moses raised by Pharaoh's daughter, of Joseph caring for his brother's children. He spoke of God's own heart for adoption, taking strangers and making them sons and daughters. "The Bible shows us," the pastor continued, his voice gentle but firm, "that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the families God brings together, about the love that grows between hearts that choose each other." Susan's small hand found Ephraim's, holding tight. He glanced down to see tears sliding silently down her cheeks, but her mouth was set in a smile of pure joy. She believed, with all her heart she believed, that God had brought them together for a purpose. Looking at her then, Ephraim felt something shift and settle in his own heart. This wasn't just about duty anymore, about honoring a dying woman's request. This was about the family God had given him, unexpected and precious. This was about fighting for his daughter. The thought struck him with its rightness. His daughter. Not just a child left in his care, but his daughter in all the ways that mattered. The fear and uncertainty of the past weeks transformed into something stronger, determination, fierce and pure as prairie steel. Later, as they drove home across the sun-washed prairie, Susan hummed hymns softly beside him. The horses picked their way along the familiar trail, their hooves raising small puffs of dust. Everything looked different somehow, charged with new purpose. "Papa?" Susan said suddenly, then caught herself. "I mean, Mr. Cole." "Papa's fine," Ephraim said, surprised by how right it felt. If that's what you'd like to call me." She beamed up at him, joy breaking across her face like sunrise. "I would. I really would." They rode on in comfortable silence, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm. Ahead, the homestead waited, sheep in the pasture, chickens in the yard, the newly sanded rocking chair drying in the sun. Their home, their family. Whatever came next, Ephraim knew he would fight for it with everything he had. Not just because duty demanded it, but because love required nothing less. Dawn painted the sky in stripes of pink and gold as hoofbeats echoed down Main Street. The circuit judge, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, rode at the head of a small procession. Two clerks followed on matching bay horses, saddlebags bulging with legal documents. News of their arrival spread through town like wildfire. Ephraim stood at his cabin window, watching the sun climb higher. His Sunday coat felt too tight at the collar, but he straightened it anyway. Behind him, Susan sat at the table, dressed in her best pinafore, carefully copying Bible verses to show her learning. "Time to go," he said softly. Susan gathered her slate, her mother's Bible, and the letter she still kept close. Her small fingers trembled as she smoothed her hair one last time. Ephraim's heart ached at her nervousness, but he forced a reassuring smile. The wagon ride to town stretched longer than usual. Neither spoke much, though Susan hummed hymns under her breath. As they approached the courthouse, Ephraim saw Naomi waiting on the steps. She wore her best dress, her dark hair neatly braided, and held a stack of papers, Susan's schoolwork and progress reports. "The Lord is our strength," Naomi said quietly as they climbed the courthouse steps. Susan reached for her hand, drawing comfort from her teacher's presence. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. It seemed half the town had crowded in to witness the proceedings. The judge sat behind his desk, stern and imposing in his black coat. His clerks arranged papers with efficient movements while deputies maintained order. "Court is now in session," the judge announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We are here to determine the matter of guardianship for one Susan May, minor child." The testimonies began. Reverend Thompson spoke first, praising Ephraim's regular church attendance and Susan's quick grasp of Scripture. "I've seen nothing but proper Christian behavior," he declared firmly. Mrs. Whitaker, the seamstress, described how Susan helped mind her younger children during sewing circle. "She's a good girl, Your Honor. Well-mannered and kind." But then Martha Tate, head of the Ladies' Aid Society, stood to speak. "It ain't proper," she declared, her voice sharp with disapproval. "A single man raising a young girl? What kind of example does that set?" More voices rose, some defending, others condemning. The judge listened impassively, making notes in his ledger. Finally, he turned to Naomi. "Miss Redbird, you've been teaching the child?" "Yes, Your Honor." Naomi stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Susan is an excellent student. She reads at grade level, shows particular aptitude for arithmetic, and dash. And you visit the Cole homestead regularly?" Someone in the crowd snickered. Naomi lifted her chin. "I do. As her teacher, I ensure her educational needs are met. Mr. Cole has provided a safe, nurturing environment." The judge turned to Ephraim. "Mr. Cole, do you have any legal documentation supporting your guardianship claim? Adoption papers? Written authorization from the child's mother?" Ephraim's throat tightened. "No, sir, just her mother's letter, asking me to care for Susan." "A letter is not a legal document." The judge's voice hardened. "Do you have any proof of your ability to provide? Property deeds? Banknotes? I work my land honest, Your Honor. The homestead provides dash." "Without documentation, Mr. Cole, I have no choice." The judge's gavel crashed down. "This court orders Susan May to be remanded to the Denver orphanage for proper placement. Deputies, take custody of the child." The room erupted in gasps. Susan's cry pierced the air as two deputies approached. She clung to Ephraim's arm, her face white with terror. "No! Please, Papa, don't let them!" Ephraim stood frozen, his heart shattering as the deputies gently but firmly separated them. Susan's sobs echoed through the courthouse as they led her away. Naomi reached for his arm, steadying him as he swayed. "The eastbound train departs in 1 hour," the judge announced. "The child will be transported immediately." Through a fog of grief, Ephraim watched them load Susan into a wagon. Her tear-streaked face appeared at the window, one small hand pressed against the glass. Then the wagon rolled away, taking his daughter with it. The train whistle pierced the afternoon air like a knife. Ephraim stood at the station, helpless, as Susan was escorted aboard. She clutched her Bible and nothing else. There hadn't been time to pack her things. The locomotive belched steam, wheels grinding against rails. Susan's face appeared briefly at a window, then vanished as the train pulled away, carrying her toward Denver. The ride home was a blur. The empty wagon seat beside him felt like an open wound. At the cabin, everything screamed of Susan's absence. Her slate on the table, her small apron hung by the door, the rocking chair they'd sanded together. Night fell, bringing no peace. Ephraim sat in darkness, unable to light the lamp she'd helped trim each evening. A soft knock broke the silence. Naomi entered, carrying a covered dish, her eyes full of sympathy. "You need to eat," she said gently, setting out bread and stew. Ephraim shook his head. "Can't." "Then just listen." Naomi sat across from him. "This isn't over. God doesn't bring people together without purpose." Her words stirred something in Ephraim's memory. Susan's mother's letter. He'd never read the second page, too focused on the first part about caring for Susan. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal on the folded paper. Lamplight revealed careful handwriting. As he read, his breath caught. There, in proper legal language, was a deed granting him ownership of her homestead land in Kansas. More importantly, clear statements of her wishes, that Ephraim Cole should be appointed Susan's legal guardian in the event of her death. "Look." He thrust the paper toward Naomi. She read quickly, her eyes widening. "This is it," she whispered. "This is legal proof of guardianship intent, and the land deed proves you can provide." Hope flickered in Ephraim's chest for the first time since the gavel fell. "How fast can we get these to the judge?" "He's still in town tonight." "We can go now." Naomi was already standing. This could bring her home. Ephraim clutched the precious documents, his heart pounding with renewed purpose. Susan's mother had provided the means to fight for their family. He just hadn't known to look for it. Now, with proof in hand and faith in his heart, he had a chance to bring his daughter home. The night wasn't so dark anymore. Hope, like a lamp newly lit, pushed back the shadows. Somewhere east, a train carried Susan toward Denver. But with God's help and these papers, she wouldn't stay there long. Ephraim would bring her back to where she belonged, home, with him, forever. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft rose and gold as Ephraim led his bay stallion from the barn. The horse's coat gleamed from careful grooming. He'd need all its strength and speed for the journey ahead. His fingers worked quickly, securing the saddle, checking straps twice. The sound of hoofbeats made him turn. Naomi rode up on her painted mare, already dressed for travel in a sturdy blue riding skirt and leather boots. A bedroll was tied behind her saddle. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly before he could speak. "The journey to Denver is long, and you'll need someone who can speak to the judge about Susan's schooling." Ephraim started to protest, but stopped himself. Truth was, he dreaded facing this battle alone. And Naomi had proven herself a steady ally these past weeks. "It's 3 days hard riding," he warned instead. "Rough country between here and there." Naomi's chin lifted. "I've ridden harder trails." A shadow crossed her face. "When my people were forced to move west, we traveled much further with far less." Ephraim nodded, chastened. He'd forgotten about the Cherokee removal she'd survived as a child. "Much obliged for the company, then," he said quietly. They set out as the sun crested the hills, horses moving at a steady lope. The morning air held autumn's bite, their breath forming small clouds. Fields gave way to rolling prairie, dotted with sage and buffalo grass. By midday, the familiar landmarks of home had fallen far behind. They stopped briefly to water the horses at a creek, sharing a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Naomi produced dried apples from her saddlebag, a welcome sweetness. Neither spoke much, focused on making good time while the weather held. As afternoon shadows lengthened, storm clouds gathered in the west. They pressed on until the first fat drops fell, then sought shelter beneath a stand of cottonwoods. Ephraim built a small fire while Naomi tended the horses, her movements sure and practiced. "Reminds me of when I first came west," she said later, as they huddled near the flames. "Mama would sing Cherokee hymns to keep our spirits up during storms like this." Her voice lifted softly in an unfamiliar melody, the words strange but beautiful. "What does it mean?" Ephraim asked when she finished. "The Lord is my shepherd," she translated. Psalm 23. Some things speak truth in any language. Thunder rolled across the prairie. Ephraim pulled out Susan's mother's letter, reading it again by firelight. The legal words blurred before his eyes. "I keep thinking about Susan alone in that orphanage," he confessed roughly. "She must be so scared." "She's stronger than you think," Naomi said. "Like you." She hesitated, then added, "I lost my father when I was near her age. The grief nearly broke my mother, but she found strength in caring for us children. Sometimes love is stronger than law." Ephraim looked at her across the fire, seeing the quiet wisdom in her dark eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." They rode out at first light, making good time across the prairie. The horses settled into a steady rhythm, eating up miles under the vast blue sky. They talked more easily now, sharing stories of their pasts. Naomi spoke of teaching in various frontier towns, facing prejudice with dignity and faith. Ephraim described his late wife, Sarah's gentle spirit, how losing her had nearly broken him. "Then Susan came," he said wonderingly, "like a light in the darkness. Didn't even know how dark it was till she brought the light back." Naomi smiled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps he sent her to heal you both." They made camp that night by a river, the water's song mixing with coyote calls. After a spare supper of beans and coffee, they sat watching the stars wheel overhead. Ephraim found himself sharing hopes he'd barely admitted to himself, of making a real home for Susan, of teaching her ranching ways, of seeing her grow up strong and happy. Naomi listened intently, then said, "She already loves you as a father. I've seen it in her eyes." "Reckon I love her like a daughter," Ephraim admitted. "Never thought I'd say that, but there it is." The third day dawned clear and cold. They pushed the horses harder, knowing Denver was within reach. By afternoon, the city's outskirts came into view, scattered houses growing denser, more traffic on the roads. The bustle and noise felt jarring after days on the quiet prairie. They found a stable near the courthouse where they could board the horses. Naomi expertly checked them over while Ephraim gathered the precious documents, the deed, the letter, Susan's school records. His hands shook slightly as he smoothed the papers. "Let me help you prepare what to say," Naomi offered. They sat on a bench outside the courthouse, reviewing the strongest points of their case. Ephraim rehearsed his words carefully, drawing strength from Naomi's calm presence. "Remember," she said firmly, "you're not just fighting with law, but with love. Let the judge see your heart for Susan." Ephraim nodded, too tense for words. Together they climbed the courthouse steps, their boots echoing on marble. The building's grandeur made him feel small and rough, but he thought of Susan's trusting face and stood straighter. Naomi touched his arm gently. "The Lord is our shepherd," she reminded him in Cherokee, then English. "He will make a way." Ephraim squared his shoulders, clutching the papers that could bring his daughter home. Whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone. With a silent prayer, he opened the heavy courthouse door. The Denver courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade cold and imposing in the morning light. Inside, polished wooden benches stretched in solemn rows. The smell of leather-bound books and floor wax filled the air. Ephraim gripped the precious papers in his calloused hands, his Sunday coat feeling rough and out of place among the fine suits of city folk. Naomi sat beside him, her quiet presence steadying. They had arrived early, but already the chamber buzzed with whispers as various witnesses filed in. To Ephraim's surprise, familiar faces from home appeared. The station master had made the journey, looking uncomfortable in his best vest. Even Mrs. Peterson, one of the town's severest critics, settled onto a nearby bench. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison." The judge entered, his black robe sweeping as he took his seat. His face was lined with experience, stern yet not unkind. He adjusted his spectacles, reviewing the papers before him. "Case regarding guardianship of Susan May," he announced. "Mr. Cole, approach." Ephraim stood, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Naomi gave his arm a gentle squeeze as he passed. "Your Honor," Ephraim began, his voice rough with emotion, "I bring proof of my right to care for Susan May." He laid out the documents with trembling fingers, the deed first, then the letter. The judge examined them carefully, holding the papers to the light. "This deed grants you ownership of 40 acres in Kansas Territory," he noted. "And this letter," his eyes narrowed as he read. "Susan's mother wrote that before she died," Ephraim explained. "She entrusted both land and child to my care, knowing my reputation for honest dealing." "How did she come to know your character?" the judge asked sharply. "Through my late wife's family in Kansas," Ephraim said. "They recommended me as a man of honor when she sought a new start out west." The judge nodded slowly. "I see references here to previous correspondence. Do you have these letters?" "No, sir. But the station master can speak to their existence. He handled the mail arrangements." The station master rose, straightening his vest. "That's right, Your Honor. Mrs. May exchanged letters with Mr. Cole for 3 months before deciding to travel west. All proper and above board." The judge turned to where Naomi sat. "Miss Redbird, you've been teaching the child?" Naomi stood, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, Your Honor. Susan is bright and eager to learn. She's already reading at grade level, and her arithmetic shows promise." "And her care? Her moral instruction?" "Mr. Cole ensures she attends church regularly. She helps with appropriate chores, says her prayers, and shows respect to elders. The child thrives under his guardianship." Mrs. Peterson stood unexpectedly. "Your Honor, I must speak." The judge gestured for her to continue. Ephraim tensed, remembering her previous opposition. "I confess I was among those who thought it improper for a single man to raise a young girl," she said. "But I've watched Mr. Cole these past weeks. He's shown nothing but fatherly care and Christian dedication. The child is clean, well-fed, and properly mannered. Perhaps I judged too hastily." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Bring in the child," he ordered. The side door opened. Susan entered, escorted by a stern-faced matron. She wore a plain dress, her hair neatly braided, but her face lit up at the sight of Ephraim. It took all his restraint not to rush to her. "Susan May," the judge said kindly. "Come forward." She approached the bench, her small steps steady. The judge leaned down slightly. "Child, are you happy in Mr. Cole's care?" "Yes, sir," Susan answered clearly. "He's teaching me ranching ways, and Miss Redbird teaches me letters. I help with the lambs and chickens." And she hesitated, then continued bravely. "He prays with me every night, just like Mama used to." The judge sat back, studying the scene before him. The earnest child, the weathered rancher, the supportive teacher, the witnesses from town. He picked up the deed again, examining the careful signature. "The law requires more than good intentions," he said slowly. "It demands legal standing, proper documentation, and evidence of suitable care." He paused, looking directly at Ephraim. "In this case, I find all 3 requirements met. Hope surged in Ephraim's chest. The deed establishes Mr. Cole's legal connection to Mrs. May's estate. Her letter clearly expresses her wish for him to guard both property and child, and the testimony of respected witnesses confirms his proper care of Susan May. The judge's voice grew stronger. Therefore, I hereby grant formal guardianship to Ephraim Cole, with all rights and responsibilities therein. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Then Susan broke free from the matron's grip, running straight to Ephraim.
"I knew you'd come,"
she whispered, burying her face in his coat.
"I knew you wouldn't leave me."
Ephraim lifted her in his arms, his vision blurring with tears. "Never," he promised hoarsely. "You're my daughter now, proper and legal." Naomi approached them, her own eyes glistening. She touched Susan's braided hair gently. "Welcome home, little one." The chamber slowly emptied, witnesses and officials filing out. The station master paused to shake Ephraim's hand. Even Mrs. Peterson offered a tearful smile as she passed. The judge gathered his papers, then looked at the small family before him, the rancher holding his daughter, the teacher standing close by. His stern face softened slightly. "Godspeed to you all," he said quietly, and left the chamber. Susan kept her arms tight around Ephraim's neck as they walked out into the sunshine. "Can we go home now?" she asked. "Yes, honey," he answered, his heart full. "We're going home." The morning sun painted the Denver streets gold as they set out, their horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestones. Susan sat proudly between Ephraim and Naomi on the wagon bench, her small hands clutching her mother's Bible. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she watched the city fade behind them, replaced by the vast expanse of open prairie. "Look at those wildflowers." Susan pointed to patches of purple and yellow blooms dotting the grassland. "Can we pick some for our table when we get home?" "Of course," Ephraim answered, his voice warmer than it had been in years. The word home felt different now, fuller somehow. The first day's journey passed quickly. Susan kept them entertained with stories from her brief stay at the Denver orphanage, though Ephraim noticed she skipped the sadder parts. His heart clenched at the thought of what she must have endured, but her resilient spirit shone through. "The other girls taught me a jumping rope song," she announced, then demonstrated by singing a cheerful tune about prairie dogs and jackrabbits. As evening approached, they made camp near a clear-running creek. Ephraim tended the horses, while Naomi helped Susan gather kindling for the fire. The spring air carried a gentle chill, and soon flames crackled merrily, pushing back the gathering darkness. "Tell me about when you were little," Susan requested, settling close to Ephraim as they ate their supper of beans and trail bread. He chuckled softly. "Well, I wasn't much older than you when I learned to rope my first calf. Made a proper mess of it, too." "Really?" Susan leaned forward eagerly. "What happened?" "Got myself tangled up instead of the calf," he admitted, demonstrating with his hands. "Ended up flat on my back in the mud while that ornery creature just stood there staring at me." Susan's giggles rang out across the prairie night. Even Naomi smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she listened. "My father didn't stop laughing for a week," Ephraim continued, surprised at how easily the memories flowed now. "But he showed me the proper way after that, patient as could be." The conversation lulled comfortably as Naomi began to sing, her voice carrying sweet and clear in the darkness. The melody was unfamiliar to Ephraim, but beautiful, a Cherokee hymn that spoke of gratitude and home. Susan watched in wonder, trying to mouth the foreign words. "What does it mean?" she asked when Naomi finished. "It thanks the Creator for family," Naomi explained, "and for bringing lonely hearts together." Her eyes met Ephraim's briefly across the fire, then quickly looked away. They spent 3 nights this way, traveling by day and camping under vast starlit skies. Each evening brought them closer, not just to home, but to each other. Susan learned more Cherokee words from Naomi and delighted in teaching them to Ephraim. He shared tales of his ranching days, and Naomi spoke of her grandmother's wisdom about plants and healing. On the final morning of their journey, they crested the familiar ridge overlooking Ephraim's land. The cabin stood waiting below, smoke rising from a neighbor's fire. Someone had thought to warm the house for their return. "Home!" Susan called out, bouncing on the wagon seat. "Look at the lambs. They've grown so much." Indeed, the spring lambs gamboled in the pasture, their wool bright in the morning sun. As they drew closer, figures emerged from behind the cabin, neighbors who had gathered to welcome them back. Mrs. Peterson stood among them, a covered dish in her hands. The wagon rolled to a stop, and Susan barely waited for Ephraim's helping hand before jumping down. She ran straight to the garden, gathering armfuls of wild daisies and prairie flowers that had bloomed in their absence. "For our table," she announced proudly, disappearing into the cabin. The neighbors approached, offering quiet congratulations and welcome home wishes. The atmosphere felt different from before, warmer, more accepting. Even those who had once whispered in judgment now stepped forward with handshakes and small gifts of food. "We kept an eye on things while you were gone," old Mr. Jenkins said, nodding toward the corrals. "Sheep are all accounted for, and that runt lamb Susan saved is doing just fine." "Much obliged," Ephraim replied, touched by their care. He watched as Naomi helped Susan arrange flowers in an old mason jar, their heads bent together in conversation. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity as neighbors came and went. Women helped sweep and dust the cabin, men checked the fences and livestock. By sunset, only a few remained, gathered around the table for a proper supper. The cabin felt transformed, not just clean and warm, but truly lived in. Susan's flowers brightened the windowsill, and savory stew bubbled in the cookpot. Laughter filled the small space as they shared the meal. Susan proudly served cornbread she and Naomi had baked, beaming at each compliment. The conversation flowed easily, no hint remaining of the tension that had divided them before. As twilight deepened, the last neighbors bid farewell, leaving dishes of food and promises to return. Susan yawned, fighting to keep her eyes open after the long journey. "Time for bed, little one," Naomi said gently. "Your forever chair will still be there in the morning." Susan nodded sleepily, hugging them both before heading to her room. No longer just a temporary space, but truly hers. Ephraim and Naomi stepped outside onto the porch, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The spring air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass, mixed with wood smoke from the chimney. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun's last rays paint the western sky in shades of purple and gold. Something had shifted between them during the journey home, something neither was quite ready to name. Their shared devotion to Susan had formed a bridge, connecting their separate worlds. As they watched the sunset fade, their shoulders nearly touching, both felt the quiet stirring of possibility. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely song answered by another. The evening breeze carried the sound of crickets and the soft bleating of sheep settling down for the night. These familiar sounds of home seemed sweeter now, filled with new promise. Inside, they could hear Susan humming one of Naomi's Cherokee hymns as she prepared for bed. The sound drifted through the cabin walls, a melody of hope and belonging that touched both their hearts. Morning painted the eastern sky in brush strokes of pink and gold, touching the dew-covered grass with sparkling light. The sun rose steadily over Ephraim Cole's homestead, warming the spring air as birds called their morning songs across the pasture. Susan burst from the cabin's door, her nightgown traded for a simple dress, her boots leaving dark prints in the wet grass. Behind her trotted the small lamb she had nursed back to health weeks ago, its wool bright white in the morning light. The creature had grown strong, but remained devoted to Susan, following her like a faithful dog. "Come on, little blessing," she called to the lamb, giggling as it bounded after her through the meadow. Inside the cabin, warmth radiated from the cook stove where Ephraim and Naomi worked together preparing breakfast. The rich aroma of coffee mingled with the smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits. They moved around each other with easy familiarity, sharing glances that held deeper meaning than either was ready to voice. When Susan returned, rosy-cheeked from her morning run, she settled at the table where an oil lamp still glowed against the shadows. Her mother's Bible lay open before her, its pages worn soft with years of faithful reading. "Mama marked this verse special," Susan said, her finger tracing the underlined words. Her voice carried clear and strong as she read, "A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling." Ephraim's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Tears welled in his eyes, but he made no move to hide them. These were not tears of grief or loss, but of gratitude, for the child who had brought life back to his home, for the woman whose quiet strength had helped them both find their way. Naomi stepped close, laying her hand gently over his. Her touch carried comfort and understanding, acknowledging the journey that had brought them all together. Through the window, sunlight streamed across the table, catching the silver cross that hung at her throat. The cabin glowed with more than just morning light. It radiated with the warmth of faith restored, of family found, and of second chances graciously given. Beyond the window, the meadow stretched wide and green, promising new beginnings for them all. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.